Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe and hit the notification bell. Don't forget to visit Locals for updates and for supporting the channel.
Hello, this is your
For
host,
those who
Todd
already
Lewis of
support,
the Praise
thank
of
you
Folly podcast.
for the support. And now I'm joined by Logos, and we're here to discuss our new series where we go through the church fathers. Now, it's quite a daunting task. The church fathers can be divided into broadly three categories: the Ante-Nicene, the Nicene, and post-Nicene fathers. And for now, we're just going to work on the Ante-Nicene church fathers, start from the beginning. And volume one of the traditional set of the English translation of the Ante-Nicene church fathers deals with Clement of Rome. So before we actually dive into his first letter to the Corinthians, I think it behooves us to sort of set up what's going on here. So Clement of Rome lived from 30 AD to 100 AD. And at this point, we're what's called the Pax Romana. So in the previous century, Rome had been torn apart by civil wars. And under Augustus Caesar, adopted nephew of Julius Caesar, the Roman state was consolidated, and the Pax Romana more or less lasts 200 years. And this is important for the perspective of the church because it's the idea of Roman roads and Roman law and Roman stability that allows the apostles, the Apostle Paul and Peter, to travel to these other locations so quickly and efficiently, and for missionaries to spread throughout the empire. At the same time as well, the lingua franca of the time is Greek. And so there's one common language for all the other Christians to speak. Now, at this point, Greek was common amongst the lower classes. The upper Roman classes spoke Latin, though eventually that will change in the East much later. But Greek is spoken by almost everybody, and so that also allows for the dissemination of the gospel. And so from the point of view of the Roman state, the goal is to maintain stability. And so, for example, the Jews are a perennial problem. There's two great Jewish revolts. There's one in 67 to 71 AD, which culminates in the destruction of the Jerusalem. And then there's one under the rule of Hadrian in 133 to 135 BC under Bar Kokhba. And so they're otherwise willing to tolerate the dissenting Jews for their peculiar beliefs, but not when it is at the expense of the stability of the state. Now, while at this point Christians are not rising up in arms against the Roman state like the Jews are, they are still perceived as a threat because they don't worship the Roman gods. And so the Romans believe that if you don't propitiate the gods appropriately, then plagues, disasters, and the entire world order will collapse. And so they're perceived as a threat, not as a military threat or seditious in the sense of revolution, like say the Jews, or in England, maybe the Druids, which are religious institutions that might lead revolts, but more at a higher order threat, the threat of the divine order. And so they sort of have a don't ask, don't tell attitude. There's a letter, I think in 1117 from Hadrian addressed to 117 rather, addressed to his Pliny, governor of Bithynia in Asia Minor, with saying that, well, look, don't go around looking for Christians, but if Christians are brought to you, for on some other charge, then, convince them to give up the faith. Otherwise, execute them. And so there's this sort of, while there is some persecution under Nero and Domitian, it's not a consistent persecution, as we'll see later in the 3rd century with Decius and Diocletian. Domitian and Nero and Domitian, it's more like they need scapegoats. So it's as long as the Christians keep their heads down, the first couple of centuries are not as bad as they will be in the third. The 3rd century is actually really bad for Christians. Now, what's the state of the church? Well, at the time of the writing of Clement's first letter to the Corinthians, there's a second letter which was attributed to him, but is considered to be spurious and is included later on in the text, the sources we're going to be reading, but are not attributed to Clement. Clement's name doesn't even appear in the first letter to the Corinthians. We believe Clement is the author because Origen and Eusebius both refer to him as the author of that letter. And so when we get to the dispute of the dating, of when it was written, the earliest it could have been written was in 68 AD. So at this point, all the apostles but John are dead. And so what we have now is the first generation of what were called sub-apostolic Christian leaders. These are the Christian leaders that studied under the apostles and are now able to stretch their wings and lead the church, because the apostles are all, except for John, all dead. And John is in prison at Patmos, and you can't really just, send John a letter and get something back right away. He's sort of out of commission until he dies in prison. So now this is where the church is starting to make decisions of how to live a Christian life without the direct guidance of people who have a hotline to God through prophetic witness. And so this is where we really begin to see within the history of the church this context of how do you live as a Christian in a day-to-day life. The other aspect here is there are basically 4 kinds of genres of writing here. There's pastoral writings, which are basically addressed to a given church or group of churches to deal with some immediate problem. Some problem maybe of sin, some problem of threats of persecution, and encouraging and instructing the congregation. Then there's apologetics, which is primarily directed towards pagans and non-believers, Jews and pagans, in order to convince them that the Christian religion is true. There are polemics, which are written against heretics in order to refute heresy, which at this time, Gnosticism is the predominant heresy. And then there's teaching. Basically, you're teaching about some given doctrine of the Christian faith without necessarily making an appeal to any given situation. Clement's first letter to the Corinthians falls into the pastoral teaching. So we'll stop here, Logos. Having set up the pagan world, the Christian world, what are some of your thoughts?
That was just really interesting. As a guy that's not really a history major, hearing like the times with Nero and the other people, like what's going on, because Rome's taught kind of like a whirlwind in school because you don't really have a lot of time to get through it. So it's like, here's Roman history. Here's a bunch of stuff that happened between 0 and 400 AD or something. And it's hard to really keep straight, like what little things are going on. And so having extra context clues like this to help straighten out the timeline is kind of cool. I guess the other big question I have is, well, maybe we'll get into it in a minute. I think the other questions I'll have are in the document. For example, like what schisms are we seeing in the Corinthian church would be the first question.
Right. Yeah, we will get to that in a moment. So now a little bit of a backstory about Clement himself and the letter itself. So Clement was a co-presbyter of Rome with Linus and Cletus, and he was the Gentile companion of Paul at Philippi. He's often identified with the Clement mentioned in Philippians 4:3. And so naturally, if we can assume that is a correct identification, Clement is going to be one of the more influential sub-apostolic Christians because he had a direct connection to the Apostle Paul. And in original Christian writings, we see that Paul was held on the same level with Peter. So the church in Rome was founded by Peter and Paul. Later on in the history of the church, it's just reduced. Well, the church in Rome was founded by Peter. So, but Peter and Paul were more on the same level earlier on in this discussion. Now, in the West, the first letter of Clement was not well known. It was really only made known in the 17th century when the Patriarch of Constantinople gave a copy to James I of England. And we believe that this was written by, again, Clement, because Origen and Eusebius attributed to him. The main dispute here is when it was written. One is that it was written during the Neronian persecution of 68 AD, and the other was that it was written under the Domitian persecution. I tend to believe it was probably written towards the end of the Neronian persecution because he makes specific reference to Peter and Paul, which if he's writing under Domitian, that's 30 years later. It's not really relevant to bring up Peter and Paul at that point because that's kind of old news. So I think the fact that he opens up his letter with a reference to Peter and Paul's martyrdom, I think in some sense tilts it in favor of the earlier date. Now, I read this once quite a long time ago, and if memory serves, he doesn't even mention the temple being destroyed, which, again, you would think if you're writing in 97 AD, some passing reference to the temple being destroyed would be important because, again, the Christians are trying to make a distinction that the old dispensation is over. And how do we know it's over? The temple's gone. And so I think those two are strong indications that this is written around 68 AD. What are your thoughts on that, Logos?
I agree completely. We talked a little bit about this before stream, and I think that makes sense to me. One of the things that stuck out to me as I was reading the letter, not knowing any history whatsoever, right? No axe to grind or anything else, was he was mentioning the recent, or not the recent, but like the passing of Paul and Peter, and it seemed to me that he was talking about it as if it was like really, really recent. Like the tone I got from reading it was something like, we're reeling from all this crazy stuff going on with us. Like these two passings a big deal. And already I'm seeing you guys popping off in Corinth and doing all this crazy stuff. Like knock it off. Like now's not the time for this. It's kind of like the tone I was getting from reading it. But that's again me not being educated in the history. So that you have a more educated reason for thinking it sounded something like that. That's good for me, I suppose.
Right. Now, the other thing that has to be pointed out is Clement's letter to the Corinthians can't be viewed in isolation from Paul's letters to the Corinthians. So, because schism and faction is the main issue in this letter, this is also what Paul's first letter to the Corinthians was addressing. So, beginning in 1 Corinthians 3, verse 4, for when one man says, I am of Paul, and another, I am of Apollos, are you not carnal? Who then is Paul? Who is Apollos? But ministers through whom you believed as the Lord gave to each one. I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the increase. So then neither he who plants is anything, nor he who waters, but God who gives increase. Now he who plants and he who labors are one, and each one will receive his reward according to his labor. So basically what Paul is addressing here is there are people in the Church of Corinth that are identifying with what we would today call schools of theology. And in the same way that you might have had in the Middle Ages saying, well, I'm a Franciscan, or I'm a Dominican, or I'm a this or that. You know, there's these schools that they're identified with these charismatic teachers. And Paul is saying, well, we don't want that. And it seems that this is more or less addressed in 2 Corinthians 7. He says that verse 8 and 9 and 10, for if I made you sorry with my letter, I do not regret it, though I did regret it. For I perceive that at the same epistle made you sorry, though for only a while. Now I rejoice, not that you were made sorry, but that the sorrow led to repentance. For you were made sorry in a godly manner, that you might suffer loss from us and nothing. For a godly sorrow produces repentance leading to salvation, not to be regretted, but the sorrow of the world produces death. So it seems that Paul has straightened this out. The Corinthian church is on a good footing. Now, at the beginning of Clement's epistle to the Corinthians, he also points out that in recent memory, they were on a really good footing, which again is indicating that it's a follow-up from what Paul had left. But it seems that the schisms, so if I had to guess, the schisms that Clement is addressing are sort of the revival of the earlier tendency that Paul was criticizing in 1 Corinthians. And so if we look at the first letter, chapter, there's a few things I think stick out. That's interesting. Unlike Paul, who does open up in his letters with his own name, Clement does not. So it shows that Clement, even though he's an author, it's not important that he's the author, right? What's important is that he is giving the message. It's not like a paper bull or anything. Furthermore, it is a letter from the Church of Rome to the Church of Corinth. We'll see in the Middle Ages, it'll be the bishop of so-and-so writing to the bishop of so-and-so. So this is completely a different context. Presbyters are used in the plural. Throughout this letter, overseer and presbyter will be used interchangeably, which is consistent with what we know from Jerome in his commentary on 1 Timothy chapter 3 and Titus chapter 1, where he says that Paul makes it clear that overseers and presbyters are interchangeable because they have the same prerequisite requirements for office. We also see that on chapter 1, he makes a reference to women who are obedient wives, dutiful homemakers, and serve the church with good deeds. So he's basically, so the two takeaways from chapter 1 are, we see a very, what we might call something more akin to a congregational or Presbyterian form of government, not a highly developed monarchical Episcopal form of government. Now, again, how Jerome calls it, he refers to it as a republic, a sort of mixed government. And so we see that here. We also see that it's important. 1 Corinthians also refers to women, 1 Corinthians 7 and 1 Corinthians 11. So all of the troubles that are going on within Corinth also have to do with something with the women in Corinth. Now, there's a reason for that. It was one of Plato's dialogues. He mentions at an aside Corinthian girlfriends as a sort of like stand-in for prostitutes. So Corinthian women were known for being notoriously loose. And so it would seem that both Paul and Clement are hammering on this point in order to straighten them out, because they seem to be the source of a lot of this conflict within the church. So what are your thoughts on the first chapter here?
Yeah, the first chapter, nothing really stuck out to me too much. Like you said, it was mostly just telling them what a good job they had been doing. I think the first time I read it, what stuck out to me was the comments on the women making good wives and whatnot specifically, right? It's like the term for that when you're looking at court cases, like hiding the ball, right? Like how subtly you're talking about certain things. But this just comes right out and says it. You know, women, you're doing well because this is what your role looks like, sort of thing. Like nothing is implied here. And so I'm thinking about the modern way in which Christians think about like marriage and stuff like that. And then I'm looking at like how it's talked about in letters like this in the Bible and so on. And it just seems so weird, kind of like how these really different messages are being sent.
Yeah, it's more direct, less ambiguity. The other thing too here is, again, I think it's really interesting that the first chapter revolves around the nature of church government and the nature of women in the church. It seems that there's a juxtaposition here, that the form of government is sort of as a framing device for how this entire dispute is resolved. And it seems that since he's going to then move into the discussion of envy and a discussion of faction, by opening with women, as Paul does, he doesn't open with women. Women is faction is dealt with in 1 Corinthians 4, 5, and 6, and women are dealt with in 1 Corinthians 7 and 11. But there does seem to be this implied connection that if you sort one out, you'll sort the other out, and so they're juxtaposed together for that purpose. Chapter 2. What he focuses on here is he praises the Corinthians for their adherence to Christian practice. Again, this is what Paul left us with in 2 Corinthians. They're on the straight and narrow. They're doing good. He says there was an absence of faction and a commitment to prayer, and they were grieved over their previous sin, which is what I just read from Paul in 2 Corinthians 7, and that they were abounding in good works. So again, this also seems to indicate that it's closer to 68 AD, because really he's describing the state of the Corinthian church right around the time of 2 Corinthians, which, had been written maybe a decade earlier. So, and as we get into the persecution, it seems that the persecution is what sort of led to this level of degradation. Any thoughts on chapter 2?
No, it just seems like a continuation of chapter 1. Aside from the notes on women and wives in the first section being noteworthy, I didn't see anything super interesting here as well.
Okay, so we're going to get to chapter 3. He again, Clement focuses on them being blessed by God, but they have become complacent, and they allow their good gifts to be taken for granted, and they fell into disorder, lust, and sin. Now, what's interesting is this also, again, depending on when this is written, now I take the earlier date, but this also seems to be in alignment with the criticism of the church of Laodicea in Revelation chapter 3. They became lukewarm. They became contented with the good gifts that they had. I mean, not that isn't a running theme throughout even the Old Testament. And of course, it's interesting that he actually does quote the Old Testament. Not for this. He says, my beloved did eat and drink, and he was enlarged and became fat and kicked. Hence flowed emulation and envy, strife, and sedition. And that's from Deuteronomy 32:15. Now, if this were written after Revelation or around the same time, then this would be a perfect time to bring up the Church of Laodicea in Revelation chapter 3. The fact that he doesn't might indicate that this occurred before, because again, this would be a good time to bring this up.
Well, I got to know, what is this Church of Laodicea? What's going on with this?
So in Revelation chapter, so the first 3 chapters of Revelation, John is giving a specific message to the churches of Asia. Now, Asia is a province of Asia Minor. So the Roman province of Asia was then given the name of the whole continent. It's really just a part of Western Asia Minor. They were basically a church that they began to trust in their wealth. They got soft and luxurious, which was the result in part of the blessings that they had received, but then they became complacent and relied on it and then forgot the true religion that got them there. And given that seems to be the same critique Clement's making of the church in Corinth, but he doesn't bring up John's prophecy, it would seem to, because this would be an apropos time to bring it up. It seemed to indicate to me that this is an earlier letter.
What's interesting to me about this as well is he's talking about how the empire coming down on Christians is one of the things that might have started the schism. And so I'm trying to track the juxtaposition where the empire is kind of cracking down, Christians are kind of like in hiding, things aren't looking great, but yet people are becoming complacent and wealthy. And you have this reference from Deuteronomy kind of describing what's going on. Can you explain that a little bit? Like why are these two things happening at the same time?
Right. So when we think of like the sort of systematic persecution of Christians, we tend to envision Rome is kind of like a modern day 20th century dictatorship, like the Nazis or the communists, where they can just mobilize all of these internal security forces to hunt people down. Now, Diocletian and then earlier Decius tried to do that, but we have to remember that one, there's a hard limit to the manpower of Rome for internal security. They have to worry about all sorts of threats. How much can they actually allocate to the Christians? But furthermore, in the first century, the persecution was rather ad hoc and sporadic. As I mentioned, Trajan didn't go out looking for Christians. And so now this is, of course, after Clement has died. But the point is, most Caesars don't go looking for Christians. Like again, Nero and Domitian do, but most don't. And it's not a state policy until much later. So it's kind of uneven. And the persecutions take place in different parts of the empire. So Nero is primarily in the west with Italy, not as much in the east. And so also there's this difference of focus, regional focus, I mean.
Okay. That makes things a little bit easier to understand. And to understand a little bit more about this schism, I mean, it sounds like, given the context and what's going on here, tell me how accurate you think this is. It seems like some of the churches in these areas might be taking different. It seems like this is more of like a political schism than like a theological schism. It seems to me like one of the big debates is how Christians should work with the empire to, avoid getting crushed, so to speak, and what that means. So should they become wealth generating centers and pay taxes? Should they kind of blend in with the culture? What should they do? And all this, of course, is coming about with the usual problems where young people always question the things that the old people tell them and so on. And one of the perennial problems with Christianity is, people that see Jesus do the miracles and then Jesus tells them something, they're really close to it. It's like, yes, sir. But then as you get further away from Jesus and the apostles and then so on, the younger people, as most young people do, have a tendency to question more and more and more. And the combined total of all this, it seems to me, is just like a political crisis of conscience more than anything else. Is that accurate?
Well, yeah, let's look at the chapter 4 here, where Clement gives a lot of Old Testament examples of envy motivating evil, right? So Cain envies Abel, Esau envies Jacob, Pharaoh envies Moses, Aaron and Miriam envy Moses, Dathan and Abiram envy Moses, and it doesn't end well for anybody that envies Moses, and then Saul envies David. So since 3 is about getting complacent with wealth and luxury, it seems that the envy being invoked here is that you want what the other guy has. And because, right, Cain wanted the praise that Abel had. Aaron and Miriam wanted the position that questioned Moses' position, as did Dathan and Abiram. And Saul envied, David's success that God had given him. So this is sort of going out on a limb, but just looking at the intertextual evidence here, I think what he's saying is, okay, you guys are getting wealthy, you're getting complacent, faction is developing around who gets to divvy up the spoils.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. I guess, how might the young and old aspect play into this? Because that's one of the things that always interests me in this is how the church develops over generations, especially as you move further and further away from the apostles. Yeah.
Well, I think in as far as what we've read, I don't see there's a lot where age comes in. He doesn't really make any reference to age. It's more to wealth and how one deals with it.
Oh, okay. I could have sworn I saw in chapter 3 he made some reference about that, but maybe I misread something.
Well, let's bring up chapter 3 here. Let's see. Chapter 3. Okay. I don't see anything about age, just someone who wants wealth and takes for granted the gifts that God gives him. Now, this is, I think, worth quoting because this is where he mentions Peter and Paul, and I think probably the strongest evidence for an earlier writing of this. But not to dwell upon ancient examples, not to dwell upon ancient examples. So he's assuming this is very recent. Let us come to the most recent spiritual heroes. Again, most recent. Let us take the noble examples furnished in our own generation. Through envy and jealousy, the greatest and most righteous pillars of the church have been persecuted and put to death. Let us set before our eyes the illustrious apostles. Peter, through unrighteousness, envy, endured not one or two, but numerous labors, and when he had long suffered martyrdom, departed to the place of glory due to him. Owing to envy, Paul also obtained the reward of patient endurance, and also, being 7 times thrown into captivity, compelled to flee and stoned. After preaching both in the East and the West, he gained the illustrious reputation due to his faith, having taught righteousness to the whole world, and came to the extreme limit of the West and suffered martyrdom under the prefects. Thus was he removed from the world. I lost it here. And went into the holy place, being proved himself a striking example of patience. So what we see here is that for whatever reason, he's attributing the martyrdom of Peter and Paul to those who envy them. Now, clearly, it wasn't their wealth that was being envied. These were not wealthy men. Possibly it's their status that was being envied, their charisma that was being envied, their perceived success within the church that was being envied. And given that Paul, in his first letter to the Corinthians, has to deal with people that think he's, that Paul thinks too highly of himself, and he has to talk them down, he might be referring to that as well. And he's basically saying that, look, if we're going to let this envy spread again, which Paul put down in the first place, at the worst case scenario, we lose our 2 best guys. The end result of this is that, our best men are killed. So keep that in mind.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I'm thinking, of course, to the New Testament story about Jesus, where why did people want to have Jesus killed? Pontius Pilate washed his hands of it and all that stuff. And it seemed to be that a lot of the Pharisees questioned Jesus, didn't like the authority that he had about the teachings and whatnot, especially since he, performed miracles and all that stuff. It seems like their challenge is like the holy authorities of the scripture was being directly challenged with that. And so it seems, I don't know, it feels almost like a crabs in a bucket thing, right? Where whenever something good comes along, whether it's Jesus performing miracles, the apostles, something else, whoever's currently in charge doesn't like losing that power. And I think that might be the type of envy that they're talking about.
Or sharing it, right? They don't want to share it either.
Right.
So, but what we have now in verses 6 and 7, so not verses, chapter 6 and 7. Chapter 6 is basically just saying that it's basically a reference to Jesus' statement that a house divided against itself cannot stand. He says that envies divide wives from husbands, envy overturns cities and nations. Faction, it would be another word you could use. But what's interesting here is how in chapter 7, Clement sort of doesn't take an imperious tone, but meets them at the same level, because he says, well, look, we in Rome, we in the church in Rome are dealing with the same sin that you are. We're not better than you. And the way that we win this fight is by focusing on Christ. And then he makes special reference to Noah and Jonah, who focused on, the promises of God and repented in this way as a model of example. So the key thing here in chapter 7 is, with a lot of religious instruction, let me put it this way, in much the same way that young birds will imprint upon the mother to learn habits and traits to survive as mature animals, humans imprint too. We imprint on each other. And what Clement is saying, well, we need to imprint on the right things. So Christ and saints and heroes from the Bible.
Now, something interesting I'm thinking about with this is the perennial problem that certain things don't scale very well with more people. And what I mean by that is, like, let's suppose a Christian church is starting and people want to get on it and, help, work it out. It gets to a point, it seems, where, especially, back then when there's not like too many people compared to now, especially. Like now it's interesting, right? Because, well, let me try to connect the dots. So you have all these people that get in on Christianity, they want to start spreading the gospel and so on. But you reach this problem where you end up having too many people wanting to kind of guide a church and make a name for themselves, spreading the gospel and so on. And something confusing about this is, I think people get this confused with pride, but it might just be a survival instinct, right? So like if you're trying to be a preacher, and there's like a whole bunch of preachers, and so everybody's kind of like competing for the same market, so to speak. Well, let's suppose it's like the days of ancient Greece when people would, like, let philosophers into their house to talk to them about philosophy or whatever. And you could get a meal, you could get shelter, you could do whatever. Well, if you're the first Christian minister coming to somebody's house, that might be a little hospitable. If you're the second one, maybe. What do you have to say that the first one didn't? What if you're like the 20th one? There might be some diminishing returns there as far as the church grows and tries to preach to the same market. And so what do? In order to distinguish yourself, just so like you can do what you feel you're called to do as far as preaching the gospel or something else, it seems like you have to differentiate yourself from the market, so to speak. And this might be a naturally occurring way that this schism happens, because in order for when a market gets sufficiently saturated of people doing any job, you have to kind of like set yourself apart from everybody you're working with. But then it has like some dual problems, right? Because you want the church to be unified. You want there to be one church so people aren't confused. You also don't want people like fighting each other and sectarianism and so on. On the other hand, if you've got too many apostles in one place trying to do one thing, or too many preachers, not apostles technically, trying to do one thing, then they can't, when there's so many coming before them already doing it. There's nowhere left for them to go. And I think this might be the root cause of all this. What do you think?
Well, I think, I guess, to what you said, right? Well, there's two ways you could deal with the up and coming new generation, right? One is, as far as making a name for yourself, to distinguish yourself from other Christian leaders. Within my reading of the New Testament, I don't think you actually want to make yourself distinct or different from other Christians. The idea that the refrain that we read throughout the Bible, specifically in John 18, where Christ said, "Be one as the Father and I are one," the goal is that we all conform to the same plan. And so the way that you would, quote unquote, make a name for yourself is if you actually just you conformed more than anyone else to the plan. But then second of all, as far as like population growth, given that there's also the Christian commitment to spread the gospel everywhere in the world, those would be people you might consider making missionaries to start planting new churches somewhere else.
Yeah, definitely. I think, yeah, owing to the second part of where I was going with what I'm saying is like now in America, let's say, you can go to cities, you can have like different churches on every church quarter. And I think this is the phenomena that I'm really thinking about, where you have a whole bunch of people wanting to be pastors, but if you have like a whole bunch of pastors already with different churches and congregations, well, what do you do? Well, the way that America can have so many different churches and pastors on like different corners of all these towns is that all these churches are different denominations. So you could have like multiple churches of the same denomination, right? So like where I live, I looked up like Eastern Orthodox churches just to see like how popular that was. And I saw like, four in one area fairly close to me. It's like, okay, if the area is big enough, you can have four churches that have different congregations. That seems reasonable. But if you have a whole bunch of people wanting to be pastors, and so let's say most of them are Protestants, it's like, well, how many pastors can reasonably fit into an area? And so this might be one of the reasons why you have this naturally occurring phenomena where you have like this sectarianism where it's like, well, yeah, I'm a Protestant pastor, but I'm different from this guy over there because I teach this instead of that, or we govern our church a little differently, or we interpret something a little differently, or so on. And so it's kind of making in economics what you call like a competitive monopoly, where you're all providing the same service ostensibly. You're all Christians, and that should be the same thing, just like fast food restaurants are all say serving cheeseburgers, but McDonald's is different from Dairy Queen, is different from Burger King, and so on. And that's a way that you don't have the same burger joint over and over and over again desaturating the market. You have to have like enough differences so that people can attend these different things and think that they're getting something different out of it. um that's, I think, what I'm more getting at. And so you talked about like missionary work, and that's true. um I guess a real issue is that missionary work is kind of dangerous, probably. I mean, sure, the Roman Empire was trying to keep peace, but I would imagine that even during Pax Romana, like barbarians were still like kind of difficult. So like Roman patrols kind of try to keep order, but it's kind of like a gray area where they're not always successful. They can't be everywhere at once, and so on. And so it's like, what do you do if you like where you live? You want to hang out with the people that you know, and you like this Christianity stuff, you want to spread the gospel, but like you have all these people that are there spreading it kind of before you do. And so it's like it's almost like if you want to jump into this new thing, it's like you have to kind of leave where you grow up or not jump on the new thing. You see what I'm saying? It causes this kind of like a friction there.
Well, yeah. I mean, as any organization grows, there's this built-in tension to keep to the original principles because it becomes harder to enforce, and there's more centrifugal forces at work. So, I mean, that's of course what Clement here is addressing. Um, but in chapter 8, he talks about God. If you repent, it's not too late. God will allow you to do that. He refers to Isaiah 1:16-20, which are two choices. You can either repent or not, and then get destroyed. And then he says, well, there's the examples of the saints, and he refers to Noah and Enoch, that they were able to escape judgment. So, right, Enoch doesn't die, goes to heaven, and Noah escapes the flood. And he then goes to chapter 10. He talks about also that Abraham had faith in God. He was hospitable, performed good works, and that God promised him a great nation and inheritance in Canaan. So basically, for the Christians, is if we continue to do that, God will honor His promises to give us eternal life. And so he's moving over to the carrot now. It's like, okay, we don't want to beat you over the head just to beat you over the head. We want to encourage you to do the right thing by making appeals to people from mostly the Old Testament here who were pursuing faith, and that they were models for us to follow.
Yeah, that made sense. I mean, some of the stuff I didn't get, like I don't remember the story of Enoch very well. I did understand the references to Noah and Abraham. Um And yeah, that I definitely took like you did. It's definitely the carrot, like, a little bit of praise, a little bit of here's what you're doing wrong, and at the end it's like, but here's what could happen if you did it better. I mean, this part's kind of this part's kind of self-explanatory.
So I think to sort of wrap up in a bow what we've read so far, what I think is interesting is the tone is very, very different from what we'll get from later leaders from the Church of Rome. Compare this to the medieval Pope Boniface's Unum Sanctum, where he says that the salvation of all mankind is contingent upon submission to his dictates, which a completely different attitude from the way Clement is addressing the church in Corinth. Notice he's basically treating them as a peer, right? It's not like, well, we're the Roman church, we're special, listen to us or else. It's like, well, no, we think that you have a problem over here. And yeah, there's been a lot of persecution. We're dealing with it too. In fact, we've been dealing with it worse because in Rome is where Peter and Paul were killed recently. But it's more like this. You should follow our example because we are doing a better job of holding up under this persecution than you are, the hard times of the Roman state, and still maintaining that Christian devotion. And to me, I think that's a really big takeaway. It just completely changes over the centuries how the church in Rome relates to these other. I mean, even within the 2nd century. I mean, when we get to Irenaeus, we'll hear about his dispute with Pope Victor, and Cyprian and Tertullian had disputes with the Bishop of Rome. So it's something that does develop rather quickly, this sort of imperious attitude. But it's not there yet. And it's also interesting that he's not making a lot of New Testament references yet. They're almost entirely Old Testament references, which I think is interesting as well. And then lastly, I guess he says the takeaway is, okay, we got a problem. Now, how do we? He doesn't just say we have a problem, right? A lot of like quote unquote Christian ministries say we'll just talk about the problem, but not how to fix or solve the problem. Oh, but here Clement does tell you how to fix and solve the problem. You fix and solve the problem by focusing on those models of faith, specifically Christ himself, but also Old Testament saints, in order to focus your mind and get back to the state that you were in, saying 2 Corinthians.
Yeah, one interesting question I had about that as well is it seems like if there's a schism, it seems like if the schism is going to be resolved, then something has to happen. A compromise, one position has to adhere to the other one, like something's got to give to end the conflict. One thing I found interesting is it wasn't super clear to me like exactly what was causing the schism. And I mean, repent and do as Abraham did and so on is great, but in terms of like realistic uh solutions, like what exactly are you going to do to solve the schism? Like, okay, both sides repent, so which side lets the other one win, so to speak, or what's the compromise going to look like to dissolve the problems that you're seeing here? I wish I would have seen more of that in the first few chapters here. That way I could get a feel for A, what the schism was about, and then B, what he would have recommended to solve it. Maybe that comes later on in the letter.
That very well might come in later in the letter, but from the first 10 chapters, the way I read it as is that the schism is rooted in envy, and the envy is rooted in people wanting other people's stuff. And the way that you would resolve it in a sort of practical application matter, again, he might even say this later on in the letter, is that you don't. I mean, if you read Acts chapter 2 and Acts chapter 4, when you join these churches, you sell the stuff that you have and then give it to the brotherhood. So there shouldn't be stuff for you to fight over. I mean, that's kind of the problem.
That's true. It depends on if yeah, I guess the problem is there shouldn't be wealth in the first place if what they want really is wealth. Um, if at a deeper level, what people really want is something like prestige or a market, or I'm trying to figure out a better way to put it. It's just like some level of notoriety. Like if everybody, let's say, wants to walk their own beat when preaching the gospel or something, there's like a place for them to do that. And wealth could just be as simple as having access to people during your preaching that might I don't know, give you food so it's easier to feed yourself. Whereas it's really, really hard to do if you've got everybody sharing the same beat and there's not enough to go around. It could be a consideration, something like that too.
Right. And also, we mentioned it's possible that the envy was a result of, well, he has gifts that I don't have, or he has prestige that I don't have. And of course, Paul does address the gift competition. That's, with this idea of the Christian as the church as a body, right? And the eye and the ear, the foot and the hands. The way that you resolve that is that, well, we all need each other, and we're going to have different gifts, and we shouldn't envy somebody for the gift that the other person has, because it's all necessary together. And ultimately, I guess, who's going to cut the Gordian knot? Well, at the end of the day, with leadership, what would be said is, can you hack it? Can you do it? And if you can't do it, you're just going to have to be a grown up and a big boy and go home and realize that's not the job for you. And then doing it is imitating what the apostles did.
Yeah, I guess that makes sense. Can't wait to read more about the letter and see what's going on.
Well, all right. I guess if there's anything you want to say before we wrap this up, or can we count that as your final statement?
Uh, I guess in short, I'd just say there wasn't too much to do here for me. I think this first letter might be more of a you thing because it's more historical, and so this is going to be kind of like story time with Todd, where I'm just kind of asking a few questions. Uh, but no, it's really, really fun going over this and thinking about this. And I think one of the most relevant things in this series will be thinking about problems that happen with the old church and then comparing them to problems that are happening with the current church. And there's so many different ways to think about it. There's the whole, is Protestant, is Catholicism true? That's one question. Or the problem of multiple denominations. Was that kind of like a problem, like even early on the church? Is it an intractable problem? Or, things like that. So when I look at this, I'm not really a history guy. Me, I'm more of like an economics guy. So I look at some of these problems that Christians are saying, and on the one hand, yeah, they're spiritual problems, but on the other hand, they can be very, very physical human problems that have things to do with like how things are scaling and other issues. Because if you can look all the way back at the historical things that could be, besieging a church, and you have those problems back then, you have these problems today at like all different points in history. At some point, you could ask the question, like, is there like some economic thing that has to be managed, like underneath all of this, as far as human interaction, to make sure these problems don't surface? Which, I don't know, maybe something better could have come of it if people had been knowing and thinking about these sorts of things. I just can't help myself. So I guess that's my
No,
final
no,
statement.
that's fine. Yeah. So thanks again, Logos. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.